Okay, now there's a final topic I want to discuss with you today in my first class, and that is a first macroeconomic model, the so-called goods market view or goods market model, which is, as we will see, the same as looking to saving and investments. And for this I need the blackboard. By the way, maybe I have to add something to this debate between classicals and Keynesians. The justification why people followed Keynes for some time, because he was arguing, well, my view, the short-run view is correct because he said, I quote, in the long run we are all dead. Yeah? And due to that fact, he was arguing, well, everything is about short run and the assumptions he has set up. But I hope you agree with me that 10 years and 20 years is not in line with this assumption of fixed prices and fixed wages. And therefore, if we see a life period of a human being, we have obviously short run, which is over, let's say, 1, 2, maybe 3 years, but anything beyond that time horizon is definitely not directly in line with these assumptions, and it's more the classical approach, and the classical view is more appropriate to these longer time periods. Okay, now let me continue with the final and the first macroeconomic model, and I promise you this is relatively simple, but it provides us and you for the first time a new insight which explains the main cause of almost any crisis and recession. And we will see it is basically the reason why we have a euro crisis, what I tell you in a second. It's the reason why we had this housing bubble and then the Great Recession in 2009. And it is also linked to almost any crisis in the past. So let me start to explain the goods market from a macroeconomic point of view. It all starts with the income expenditure identity. We already learned today. Why GDP output is equal to consumption, investment, plus government spending. By the way, I first discussed this model in a closed economy, and therefore I stop here. Later on, in 10 minutes, I will open up the economy and I will write down here net exports. But let's first do this for a closed economy. This is the income expenditure identity, and now the first step is let me rearrange the income expenditure identity. Let me bring the household consumption and the consumption of the government or the government spending on the other side. So then I have Y minus consumption, household, minus government spending is equal to investment. So what do we have here on the left hand side? It's the overall income minus consumption, household and state. Do you know another name for this variable, income minus consumption? It's saving. And that's the saving if, let's say, if you have an income of 100 euros, you consume 10 euros, well, the remaining part is your saving. And that's the same for the macroeconomy. Yeah? Overall income, GDP, minus all the household consumption, state consumption, gives me the saving. So this is nothing else as the aggregate saving, and obviously in a closed economy we see from this equation that aggregate saving is equal to investment in a closed economy. Now let me illustrate this graphically. So we have a graph and we plot a saving and an investment curve, and both curves depend on the interest rate. I will write down R as the real interest rate. To make clear, it's a real model. So think about the situation of a high interest rate. If the interest rate is high, then saving is very attractive. You save a lot. You save a high amount. So high interest rate, high saving. That gives me a point here. If the interest rate is low, like it is at the moment, well, saving is not attractive. You save a low amount. Low. So we are here. So if we have 2 points, well, we can see the saving curve probably is an upward sloping curve in relation to interest. That's the saving curve. And now I will develop the investment curve, the other part. If the interest rate is high, then credit is very expensive. Then investments are low. For a high interest rate, credit is very expensive. There are only a few investments. But if credit is cheap, that's the situation today, well, then people invest a lot. So high investments. So what we see from this, the investment curve is a downward sloping curve in respect to interest. Now we have an intersection point, and we call this in economics, as you all know, an equilibrium. E. In this equilibrium point, everyone can see saving is equal to investment. That is the situation in a closed economy. By the way, this looks like supply and demand, right, in Econ 1, and this beautiful equilibrium point. Keep in mind that all the models in economics, they are just reference points. In praxis, we are never in an equilibrium. We are usually out of equilibrium. Only in our fiction we believe that due to market forces, in the longer run, we converge to this point. It's a reference point. But most of the time, and that's true for micro models as it is true for macro models, we are not in this beautiful point of equilibrium. And that is the reason why some people or students that learned it once at the university and then applied in praxis, and then they wonder why the model has not predicted the financial crisis. Okay. Now let me discuss the same issue for an open economy to illustrate the difference. So I already told you that in an open economy we have to add up exports minus imports in sum what we call net exports. So this is the new component. I can say this is the closed economy, and then we add up net exports, the open economy component. And net exports, let me write it down again, is nothing else as export minus the imports. So if I expand this equation to an open economy, and now I do the same rearrangement as I did for the closed economy, well, then we see immediately we have to add up net exports here. Then we move still these two components on the other side. It's still aggregate consumption, but in an open economy, we have this additional component of net exports here. And usually in textbooks, then this equation in the open economy case is written differently. So usually they also then bring the investment on the other side and write saving, yeah, minus investment is equal to net exports. So this is now, it's the same, it's just investment on the other side. This is now the equilibrium identity in an open economy model. And now I want to illustrate this graphically in the same picture, the open economy case. So in an open economy, obviously, we have to look where is saving minus investment equal to net exports. So what is net exports again? It's the difference of exports minus imports. And as you all know, or probably have heard, some countries, they are exporting more than they're importing. In other words, in some countries, the net exports are positive. Yeah? Positive means exports are greater than imports. They export more than they import. And this constellation, so if the net export is positive, or you can say net export is the same as a current account. That's the accounting framework. And if this is positive, we call this the countries have a current account surplus. So if a country has a current account surplus, that means they are exporting more than they're importing. And X is positive, or the current account is positive, CA is positive. There's the other possibility. Net exports are negative. That means the current account, which is a synonym in this class, yeah, we are not differentiating the slight differences here. The current account, or the net export is negative, means there's a current account deficit. And that means net export is negative. This country is importing more. The imports are greater than the exports. Yeah, then the net export is negative. Can you give me examples for current account surplus countries and current account deficit countries? So countries, surplus, once again, is exporting more than they're importing. A deficit country, current account deficit country, is importing more than it is exporting. Yeah?
A current account surplus might be in Germany.
In Germany, we have a current account surplus. We are exporting more than we are importing. Right. An example for a deficit country?
Paraguay.
Sorry?
Paraguay.
Paraguay?
Paraguay in South America.
So I have not the data by heart. I trust you. Let me ask for a more obvious country, which I know it definitely.
Greece.
Greece, yeah. Greece has a current account deficit. They are importing more than they are exporting. An even better example, a big economy with a current account deficit. The US. Right. The US has a current account deficit. It is importing more than they are exporting. And it's a huge, by the way, deficit. Germany has a huge surplus. Another big surplus country in the world is China. Yeah? They are also exporting far more than they're importing. Okay. So, if a country has a surplus, exporting more than importing, then from this equation, take a look to this equation. That means immediately, if this is positive, saving is greater investments, right? That follows from this identity. A surplus country, like Germany, saves more than it invests. Take a look to a constellation in my picture. If we have a point here, here, saving is greater than investment. It's true also for here. So all the points above the equilibrium are reflecting the situation of countries with a current account surplus. Because for a current account surplus, from this equation, we see that's the same as greater savings than investments. Yeah? If S is greater than I, there's a positive number, and X is positive. Surplus. And that is true for all points here, because here the saving is greater than the investment. The opposite is here for the deficit countries. Deficit, net export is negative. That means that the investment is greater than the saving. Yeah? This. And that is true for all the points below my equilibrium. So here we can say net export positive, surplus, and here we can say net exports negative or current account deficit. So Germany is probably here in this area somewhere, and the US as a deficit country is here. And now let me discuss at the end of this class what is going on if countries have a current account surplus and if a country has a current account deficit over time. Usually, as you have learned in microeconomics, if we are outside of equilibrium, then there's a market force. In the goods market, the price mechanism that pulls us back to our equilibrium. And the first question we have to study now here in the macroeconomy, in this model, what is the market force? What is the equivalent price mechanism that maybe pulls countries back? And the second question is it possible maybe for some countries to always have surpluses or deficits? Let me start with the second question. Usually, if you look over the longer term, and if you study the exports and imports, so the current account of a country, what we usually see that they are fluctuating. In some decades you have surpluses, in some decades you have current account deficits. In Germany, for instance, in the 1990s, after the German reunification, we had in Germany a current account deficit. We imported more than we exported because we built the streets, the factories in the eastern part of Germany due to the reunification. So there was more import than export at that time. And since the millennium, this has changed. Now the infrastructure is more or less rebuilt in the eastern part, and now we are once again exporting more than we are importing. Now we have surpluses. So you see, Germany has also, at some time we had deficits, and at some time of the past years we had surpluses. And that is true what you can show for almost all countries. Another good example is Norway. When Norway started to invest in oil production, they first bought the infrastructure, the refineries and stuff. At that time, for a couple of years and a decade, they had deficits because they had to import all these techniques. And now they have the techniques, they produce oil, and they sell the oil. And now they are exporting more than they're importing. Now they had for some time a current account deficit in the beginning, and now for some time current account surpluses. So usually, in normal situations, you are fluctuating from surpluses to deficits. And now I have to address the first question. Despite from these fluctuations, there's also a market mechanism that usually pushes countries, if they have a large surplus, back to equilibrium or to a deficit, or if you have a deficit, there's a mechanism that pushes country usually up to surpluses. And this mechanism is the exchange rate. Let me explain what usually happens. if we have a free floating exchange rate, that means the exchange rate is not fixed and no central bank or other institution is trying to manipulate the exchange rate. So if we have a free floating exchange rate, and let's say we have Europe, by the way, Europe as a whole has an almost balanced current account. Germany has big surplus, but Greece, as we already heard, Spain, and other countries, they had deficits. So if we add up the European Union overall, it's almost balanced. But suppose for a second, Europe as a bloc has a surplus. US, as we have learned, has a deficit. We have a free floating exchange rate between the US dollar and the euro. Yeah, that's fluctuating, determined by supply and demand in the market. So what is happening if we have a surplus and the US has a deficit with the exchange rate? If we have a surplus, we are here. That means we are exporting more than we are importing. That is signaling to an investor, well, this economy is competitive. Our products are very good. We can sell, we can export a lot. We can sell because the products are cheap and high quality. If you have a deficit, you have problems with exporting. You import more. That means the products you have are maybe either too expensive or the quality is not as good. So for a surplus country, this is an attractive country. It's a competitive economy. And they have higher interest rates, as we can see. They have interest rates here. So investors bring money to surplus countries. If they demand the euro, then the euro currency appreciates in value. It gets more and more expensive. And then our products, which were very competitive, are more and more expensive. And then the competitiveness is reduced because of the appreciation of the exchange rate that makes our products more expensive and makes it more difficult for us to export. And therefore exports are declining, and due to our strong currency, imports are more attractive than for us. So that reduces our surpluses. Can you see that the exchange rate mechanism in a free, if it's free floating, flexible, is bringing down surpluses due to this market force. And the same happens for the deficit, because if you invest money in Europe, you sell US dollar. That makes the US dollar weak. If the US dollar is weak, then the products in the US are cheaper. And therefore, then the products are so cheap that even the US with the bad quality, let's say, they can start to export these products because now they are attractive, they are cheap due to the weak currency. So usually the exchange rate mechanism leads to an adjustment of the current account. But there is a problem. Sometimes countries fix the exchange rates or intervene in the exchange rate market. And that is the case between two big players where we have a global imbalance in the current account, US and China. China has a surplus, the US has a current account deficit. Here the exchange rate between the US dollar and the Chinese yuan is not flexible. The Chinese central bank keeps the Chinese currency at a low level to make the economy and the products they have and produce very competitive. And therefore, they export a lot because products are very cheap, because they fix the exchange rate at a low level, and the US has problems. That currency is strong. So what are they doing in praxis, the Chinese central bank? In simple words, they buy US dollars to make the US dollar strong and sell its own currency to make their own currency weak. And therefore, all the products are very cheap and they can export a lot. And due to the strong US dollar, the US has problems to reduce the deficit. The problem with this intervention is the following. Then the Chinese central bank, they have all the US dollars in the basement. And they asked the question, what can we do with the US dollars from this policy? Well, they reinvest the US dollars in the US, buying treasury bonds, treasury bills, housing market, and so on. And that was the macroeconomic origin, or one macroeconomic origin, of the financial crisis. So the financial crisis has not only happened because of these new financial instruments, bad rating agencies, this securitization market, CDOs, and so on. The macroeconomic origin of the financial crisis has to do with the global imbalances between the two big players on the global level, China, surplus, and US current account deficit. Due to that artificial situation, they switched off the adjustment mechanism, the exchange rate. They're building up pressure, in the whole world. And at some point, then this pressure goes in another direction. It moved into the housing market. The reinvestment, all the dollars have to go somewhere. And that was the macroeconomic origin of this crisis. And by the way, as long as we are unable to tackle and to solve the current account imbalances, it's just a matter of time to see future crises. There's no question, because if we switch off an adjustment mechanism and we sustain these imbalances artificially, well, somewhere this bypasses this process and builds up bubbles at another place. And the same origin from a macroeconomic point of view is the case in Europe. We have fixed in the Eurozone the currency across countries. Deutschmark, Italian lira, Greece, drachme, and so on. So what we did, we switched off the exchange rate mechanism. At the same time, as you know, we have countries like Germany, surplus, and countries like Greece, less competitive, current account deficit. They cannot adjust as they did in the 80s, where each country had its own currency. That is now impossible because switched off, we have just one currency, the euro. And therefore we have pressure. We are competitive, we have surpluses. Greece's economy is less competitive, they have deficits. And therefore we have problems in the Eurozone that led to this crisis. The macroeconomic origin is behind the divergence of the current account imbalances inside the Eurozone. And therefore, we cannot solve this crisis by giving countries which are less competitive more and more money. Liquidity does not solve this. What they have to do, they have to increase the competitiveness of its economy. And that means reforms. They need structural reforms. Just giving credit and credit does not solve the origin, the macroeconomic origin of this problem. The macroeconomic origin can only be solved because the exchange rate can't do it, switched off in a currency union, is by making reforms, regaining competitiveness. That's the only way. And that is the current situation we are in, that countries, obviously, it's very hard if you are less competitive and you have to do the reforms to regain competitiveness. It's hard for the people in these countries. But I tell you what, if you look back, in 2002, 2003, Germany was the sick man in Europe. We had the highest unemployment rates across all European Union countries. We had the lowest growth rate. And at that time, policymakers in Germany realized we have to do something. We have to make reforms to regain, once again, competitiveness, to reduce our unemployment rate, to make the economy more competitive. And then a left government at that time implemented labor market reforms, good market reforms. They also did tax reform. And the reason why we are strong in the past years and why the economy is doing well and moved back very soon out of the recession in 2009 has to do with the structural reforms the German government has implemented 10 years ago, around 2002, 2003. And at that time, Maybe you cannot remember that. At that time, we had also demonstrations on the streets in Germany because it was about lowering and flexibilizing the labor market, starting and institutionalizing a so-called low-income sector, which was not in place in Germany since then. Now we have this. Yeah? And there were a lot of resistance and demonstrations. And of course, that is hard if you cut back to make the overall economy, however, in the long run, once again, competitive. Now we are benefiting from these reforms, and we have learned the lessons. And that is probably why most of the European countries now demand from the countries which have problems, structural problems, the deficit countries, they cannot really export because the economy is not competitive, why these countries have to do the structural reforms. Just giving liquidity and money is not enough. They have to change the institutional setup of these countries, and only if they achieve this, then we can sustain the European Monetary Union. Otherwise, the breakup is more likely than a long-run stable euro currency. Okay, at that point I will finish for today. Wish you a nice day. See you next week. Bye-bye.